Hey, we haven't done one of these in a while, so let's talk about a game design term. All the usual caveats apply. Game design terminology is really fluid, so these definitions may change depending on who you're talking to. I'm not the arbiter of anything, but just a random guy on the internet, and any ideas discussed here aren't meant to be absolute or binding, but more like guidelines and jumping off points for discussion. Okay? Okay. So let's talk about perceivable consequence. This one's actually pretty straightforward. Coined by Doug Church all the way back in 1999, perceivable consequence was originally formulated as simply a clear reaction from the game world to the action of the player. That is, it's what you get when the game recognizes players' input and conveys the results of that input back to the player, such that they know the scope and impact of what they did. You press the A button in Sonic, so Sonic jumps, and you can see how high and how fast and at what angle. From there, the player can achieve what Church called intention, the player's ability to formulate a plan based on their understanding of the mechanics. The two are intertwined. To formulate a plan, you need to be able to predict the outcome of your options, and to predict those outcomes, you need an understanding of how the game will respond to any given stimulus. Perceivable consequence might be better thought of less as a tool, as Church suggested, but as an aesthetic goal. A goal that's desirable in some scenarios and less desirable in others. Generally speaking, it's going to be more favorable in games with win states that are to be arrived at through skill or strategy, both of which are undermined if perceivable consequence is lacking. It's easiest to see this in spatial games. Your inputs manipulate the position and rotation of objects that can easily be rendered on screen in real time. The perceivable consequence in a game like Super Hexagon borders on the self-evident. Right turns me clockwise, left turns me counterclockwise, hitting a wall means game over. From there I can formulate plans about how to tackle each pattern the game throws at me based on where I am on the screen. But it's not just video games. I mean, you could say the same thing about chess. The entire game is about understanding the consequence of your actions and how that will change the movement of your opponent, and in turn how that will limit you in the future. And playing chess 5 steps ahead of the other player can only happen when you know the likely outcomes of each turn. And even in games with random elements, perceivable consequence can still exist. You still may know the respective odds of any given event, and you know what happens given the outcome of those events. All of this sounds really self-apparent, but it's not all that uncommon for games that might benefit from perceivable consequence to ignore it. Ever play a game where you walk into a room and suddenly you've triggered a boss fight without any warning or time to prepare? I mean, that doesn't really happen here, but you know what I mean. Ever kill an NPC in Morrowind only to find out after the fact they were tied to the main questline? These are the primary sorts of situations Church was interested in looking at, as keeping the player informed allows them to plan better and also prevents the player from feeling like they were tricked by the game. So in general, for system mastery, win state-oriented games, it's good to know how your inputs impact the game state. But are there any games that benefit from a lack of perceivable consequence? Well, pretty much any game where you don't want the player to know what will happen when they act. Take Dragon's Lair, where players are asked to respond to sort of proto-QuickTime events with no information about what the right choices really are. Play the game for the first time without any indicators on, and you will fail. A lot. But Dragon's Lair was, after all, an arcade game designed to get the proprietor their money's worth, making a game that relied on more than just skill and intention, but memorizing the game's various consequences was largely the point. A lot of absurdist games, like Please Don't Touch Anything, are built on that premise. Figuring out what each interaction does in any given context is the whole point. Or consider, say, the Stanley Parable. The game relies on a feedback loop where options are suggested but can be ignored, and it's the unknown consequences for subordinates that make it so amusing. What happens when you take the right door? What happens when you stop listening? Other times, hiding consequences is done for narrative reasons. Spec Ops: The Line relies on denying players a complete view of the consequences of their actions, not just for its big gut-punch twist, but also throughout the game. Scary games also tend to rely on a degree of unpredictability in player interaction. Eternal Darkness, for example, was quick to fake players out with its sanity system, and games like PT and Spooky's House of Jump Scares vary the mechanics by which monsters go after you without any explanation in order to keep players on their toes. There are lots of reasons to keep players in the dark about how their inputs will change the game. You just have to be aware that you're serving goals that aren't skillful system mastery. Another thing that fascinates me about the idea of perceivable consequence is that it gets weird when people enter the picture. Super-deterministic, predictable systems are great for, say, spatial traversal. They're almost mandatory, actually, unless you're doing something particularly experimental. But they kinda suck when it comes to dealing with characters in games. At least, characters we want to see expressed as people rather than props. The denizens of SimCity, the fact that they're predictable algorithms is fine. But think of the spin-wheel interactions with non-player characters in Oblivion, or the animal befriending systems in Spore where you're supposed to just parrot whatever the other species does. We don't like those sorts of systems because it boils down the messy, complex, but rich act of reaching out to another person and getting to know them to a game of Simon. We yearn for systems more complicated than that because people are more complicated than that. Getting people to do what we want isn't a problem with formal rules where we need but ask the right way, so social mechanics with easily predictable outcomes feel boring and shallow. But when we're playing a game that's skill and strategy based, we also want the game to acquiesce to our needs. We don't want all of the baggage and complexities of real human interaction. We don't want an NPC to scour at us because she and her husband had a fight last night. We just want to sweet talk them into 10% off of their goods. It's a difficult balancing act to get right, and I don't think I've ever seen it done well procedurally. It takes a writer's deft hand and limited interaction to make characters that are believable but still operate in a space where you can interact with them and achieve your goals. Finally, it's worth noting that not all games can easily update you on the state of the system, and that's a big part of having players understand the ramifications of their actions. It's actually pretty easy to end up creating a game that is irreconcilably complex. For example, some game developer friends of mine were trying to make a game about high school students. The core gameplay mechanic was spreading rumors by passing notes in class. So you could write down that Adam likes Josh, for example, and then pass that note to Kelly. And when Kelly reads the note, her opinions of those in the rumor would be adjusted based on her existing opinions. The idea was to simulate a social network where cliques would form dynamically, because students would value existing friendships and rivalries over things that challenged their existing worldview. But the game was more or less untenable, even as a prototype. Not for any technical reason, but because the end result of the game may as well have been driven by a random number generator from the player's perspective, even at smallish classroom sizes of 12 or so students. It's one thing to have a matrix of each student's relationship with each other, even though at 12 students that's 66 relationships you'd need to know. But this game wasn't modeling the relationships themselves, it was modeling each student's opinion of all of the other students. So instead of 12 students resulting in 66 relationships, you had 11 opinions per student times 12 students, or 132 opinions. To play the game and influence students properly, you needed to know a huge 12 by 11 matrix, which no one can really keep inside their head. So keep in mind that perceivable consequence isn't just a matter of informing the player. It's not purely a user interface consideration. It's also about keeping systems and their interactions at human comprehensible levels of complexity. Ultimately, as big game design ideas go, perceivable consequence is super simple. It's letting the player reliably know what's going to happen when they do something in the game before it actually happens. It's something designers should very much strive for in games that are about traditional system mastery. But it can be subverted intentionally in lots of interesting ways, and sometimes blocking the player from knowing what they're doing can be used to really great effect. Just don't expect those games to end up on the tournament circuit.